Yes, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this public keynote. My name is Katrin Klemann. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the German Maritime Museum, Leibniz Institute for Maritime History. And this keynote is actually part of a conference titled Planetary Waters, a challenge between abstraction and empathy that takes place from today to Friday. The conference was organized by my colleagues Noemi Cagliati and Fabienne Will and myself. And the conference is generously funded by the German Maritime Museum and the German Research Foundation through an international scientific events grant. The event is organized in collaboration with the New Institute's Center for Environmental Humanities, NICE, the UNESCO Chair on Water Heritage and Sustainable Development at Ca' Foscari University in Venice, and the Munich Science Communication Lab at the Deutsches Museum. This conference has also been endorsed as a UN Ocean Decade activity. This means that this event has been officially recognized as contributing to the goals and visions of the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, and that our conference supports the decade's overarching aim, to generate the science we need for the ocean we want. That is a clean, healthy, resilient, productive, predicted, safe, accessible, and an inspiring and engaging ocean. We are very glad that we could win Professor Dr. Elda Miramontes to give this keynote tonight, but before I introduce her, I have to say a few housekeeping things. This event here, live at the DSM, will be filmed, recorded, and also distributed via Zoom. And for the people on Zoom, we are also recording the chat, where you can ask questions. And later, when you ask questions, please remember to ask them into the microphone so the people on Zoom can also hear them. And after the Q&A, we invite you to join us for a reception just over there. And yeah, we can share a meal and a few drinks. And if you're cold, because the air conditioning seems a little bit cold in here, my boss has graciously provided blankets. You can find them there by the window. So if you're cold, just grab a blanket. And yeah, now without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Elda Miramontes, who completed her degree in marine sciences at the University of Vigo in Spain in 2013, and her PhD in marine geosciences at Ifremer, the French National Oceanography Center in Brest in France, and where she also received her PhD in 2016. During her PhD, she investigated the relationship between submarine landslides and sedimentary deposits formed by the oceanic circulations in the Mediterranean. During her postdoctoral fellowships at Ifremer and at the University of Brest, she continued investigating how the oceanic circulation shapes the ocean floor and changes the characteristics of the marine sediments. In June 2019, she joined the University of Bremen as a junior professor in sedimentology at the Faculty of Geosciences and as a member of MARUM, the Center for Marine Environmental Sciences. Now she's a full professor of sedimentology at the University of Bremen and the vice president of MARUM. So yeah, thanks for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here today. I'm gonna check if this works. Yeah, so today I'm gonna talk about plastics in the ocean and how this kind of new pollution, well, not so new, it's been for a while already around, but it's getting worse and worse, and how this gets to the ocean, especially to the deep ocean floor. So the production of plastics started increasing dramatically in the 50s, and since then it has been going up and up and up without any view of a stop in the coming years. So now we are around here in 25, and this is a prediction until 2040, and the prediction says that it's going to keep increasing in all the continents, in all the regions. On the right graph, you can see wait. Okay. Well, so we have more and more production of plastics, and as you all know, we have them everywhere. In our clothes, we have more and more synthetic production of clothes. We find them in a lot of packaging material. This is actually the largest contribution of plastic, this packaging material, and where we could actually remove a bit because this is very often things that we don't need. It's just it's convenient, but it is only one use and then it's thrown away very fast. So yeah, recently this proportion of packaging plastics is the largest one, but it's expected that in the coming decades it's gonna keep increasing, and also the packaging will keep being one of the largest production of plastics. But we also use it in other environments, so we use it for textiles, transportation, so a car, inside a car nowadays, for example, is full of plastic material, in electronics, cables, for example, material in the hospital. So basically everywhere in our daily life we are surrounded by plastics. So it all will be fine if we just keep it in our environment where we are living, but doesn't reach the natural environment. And the problem is that most of the plastic does reach the environment. And actually most of it is also, or a large proportion, is mismanaged. As you can see here, 50% of it goes to landfill, so it gets buried. Part of it gets also incinerated, here the orange part, and only a tiny part gets recycled, is the green part here. So as you can see, it's only very little amount of the plastic that is really recycled, and even if it gets recycled very often, we cannot do endless recycling cycles because the material loses its properties and you need to start again a new production. And the largest problem is that a very large amount of it gets mismanaged. And this amount here in megatons, you see, is going to increase over time because the large production is not decreasing in the coming decades. A big part of it is ending in the blue part, so 75 remains on land, but still 30% of it goes to the rivers, and finally through the rivers can reach also the oceans. And that's the part that we will discuss today, all this, how does it happen, this transport, and where can we expect to find this accumulation. And it's important to know these pathways because otherwise it's very difficult to predict what is the potential impact if we don't know where it's accumulating primarily. Yeah, so I am a marine geologist. I usually study sediments, so sand in the coastal environment, in the deep sea. So why am I actually interested in this kind of topic of plastic pollution? Well, what we study is how particles move from the continent to the ocean. And this kind of movement is controlled by different processes. For example, we have rivers that carry the sediment, carry the sand, the mud, and then they bring it to the coast. And then at the coast, it builds what we see all around Bremen here. We have sometimes beaches, sometimes we have estuaries. So all these processes is what we are experts on. And nowadays, we don't only have in these particles, natural particles, but also anthropogenic particles, so particles that were created by humans, such as plastics. And they follow the same laws, they follow the same physical processes, and that's why at the end we have a connection in the topics. So we have a lot of production of contamination on land, in the cities, with all our activities, but also in the coastal environment and in the offshore part. So we have more and more activities also offshore, like offshore energy, fishing activities, and all of this is also producing some pollutants and changing as well how particles are transported. And then I will show you a bit later more details on how actually these particles go to the deep sea, how ocean currents can move them around, and what other kind of special, maybe a bit less famous processes might be crucial to bring them to the deep sea. And from the geological perspective, actually, we are in a very special moment, not from the positive part, interpretation of the word special, but rather from the negative, because we are now in a moment where we don't only have natural particles that are accumulating, we don't only have natural rock formation, but we have a mixture also with all our rubbish. And this rubbish, especially plastics, is in many places being mixed with the natural rocks. So, for example, a famous one is in many beaches, volcanic beaches also, where there are black rocks, and when you have black rocks, they get heated very much, and if there are plastics there, they melt, and they get fusion within the rock. So many geologists suggest that this might show a new type of rock, a new type of sediment that is being created nowadays, and not only because of this, but many other parameters that are changing in the whole world and that can be registered in the sediments. And in the future, once future geologists come back and look at our layer of sediment accumulated right now, they can see these changes. So there are some groups that suggest that we are now in a new epoch that is the Anthropocene, that we will be able to track it in the future because all of the changes that we are creating in our environment. Yeah, so plastic is a component of all the rubbish that we can, or litter, that we can find in the oceans, but not only. Here you have an example of what there were many places around Europe that were analyzed, and they did some statistics to know in the different locations of the environment what can we find. So on the shelf up here, that is this relatively shallow environment near the coastline, usually in between the coast and 100 until 200 meters with a depth. We have mainly plastics, but also other materials like fishing gear, because it's also a zone that is often used for fishing activities. If we go already a bit to the area that is getting steeper on the ocean, that is the continental slope, where there are also often a lot of canyons. Canyons are incisions, valleys, a bit like rivers under the ocean, where we have also a transport of material downslope. And there we find also a lot of fishing gear, but again, mainly plastics. And if we go farther away from the continent, we see that the amount of plastics already gets reduced. And then we have mainly fishing gear, glass, especially on the ridges and the deep part of the basin, because the plastics are most of them coming from the continent. So in general, the farther we are, the less it is. But it's not that simple, and this is what we are going to see later more in detail. So as you can see, very wide variety of litter we can find, from some nets, just some packages, this can, some bags, so a lot of things. And you can see also the problem is that sometimes, well, it's swimming around, might not be so dramatic, but the problem is when it gets entangled also on some particular organisms that live at the seabed. And this is, the key motivation of studying this is also to better control the potential impact that it can have. And so that we can create more and more evidence to try to reduce, because the solution is not picking it up. This is impossible, it's already there, impossible to recover, but we need to stop producing that much, and especially making that not so much reaches the ocean, because once it's in the ocean, it's impossible to remove. Yeah, so what we see from these kind of images of the seafloor taken with underwater cameras or autonomous robots is that we have a lot of plastic, but these are macroplastics. And probably many of you have heard also about microplastics. And microplastics is a huge component of all this plastic pollution. But first, let's see what are microplastics. Well, the official definition says that everything that is smaller than 5 millimeters, well, some consider 1 millimeter, but let's say very small, you cannot see it easily with the naked eye, is considered a microplastic. And we can have many different types. Sometimes it's just some spheres, some pellets. Actually, these pellets, there are plenty. I don't know if some of you maybe come from the region of Dortmund and over there. So there is a lot of production of plastics in factories. And they transport these kind of pellets in bags. The problem is that these bags sometimes break. And when they break, these start getting spread in the river, and then you can find them in many places all along the river. Not only there, also it's very common in the ocean, because sometimes containers full of these kind of pellets that are the primary production of plastics, they use it to create other materials of plastics. When these containers fall during a storm or any problem, then they spread in the ocean, and you can find them in many beaches. So these could be first primary microplastics. So they are plastics that are produced already in a small size. The same we can find also sometimes in beauty products, this kind of balls. Now, luckily, they are stopping producing them more and more, and they are using more organic materials, but it still is a common source of microplastics that they have these small particles in it, and this is already small from the beginning. But there is also the secondary microplastics, and in this case, we have the large macroplastics, so large material, that over time it breaks down into smaller particles, and these smaller particles can get smaller and smaller, and this is, until takes a very long time. So these will be the fragments, but very common are also fibers, especially from clothes. And you might think it's not so important, but when you look, actually, when you clean at home and you look at all the dust we have, it's full of fibers, actually. And very often, well, it could be if it is cotton, but we have more and more clothes that are synthetic, so this also produces a lot of microfibers. And there are estimations that say that after every wash in the washing machine, we produce around 300,000 fibers. And the problem is the washing machine, of course, doesn't filter it, and then it goes to the water treatment plants, and most of them also don't filter these very small particles. So they are huge contributors of microplastics to the rivers or directly to the coast if we are in a coastal environment. There are some initiatives to try to make them a bit more efficient, but it still is a huge problem. So here you have a sketch of the source and sinks of the plastics with some numbers. There were some people try to quantify how much we produce on land with our all human activities, factories, and water treatment plants and everything. Part of it remains on land and stays in the soil, but a big part is transported through the rivers to the ocean. And some of it might remain in coastal environments, and some of it might go to the ocean surface, and a huge part is going to go to the deep sea. The problem is that we have still a lot of question marks in this sketch, because there are many, there are not so many studies, especially in the oceanic part, where we can have numbers about how much is coming and how much it corresponds to the total amount of the production. So we're going to go a bit through the different compartments from the coast to the deep sea to see how this transport might occur. So a place where we are maybe more used to see, because it's easy to see with our eyes in the coastal environment when we go to the beach, and very often we see some litter in the beach, already macro litter, but also if you can imagine that there we're using macro litter, there must be also some micro. Yeah, so we say already a lot of the material is transported through the rivers to the coastal environment. And this is an example just from that I found in coastline in Spain, where my parents live, when I'm from originally. And yeah, very often we see that there is some litter coming back from time to time, but not all the time. It seems there are some processes, storms, the tides that bring back the material. And it was very interesting, this one, because it's a yogurt from Danone. But I don't know if you recognize the logo. It's not the modern logo. So actually, I was checking, and it's a logo from the 80s. And I found that last year. So it means that it's still very well preserved. So probably it was buried somewhere in the coastal environment for a while until there was a storm that brought again the sediments up and brought also these plastics to the coastline. And I found another one that looks like that. It's exactly the same one. But something happened to it. So actually, the preservation of all this pollution depends a lot on the environment where we are, and also on the processes that is gonna affect it. So for plastics, the main process that degrades it is the sun, the ultraviolet radiation. And this is going to degrade and change the properties of the plastics very fast. But if it is buried, especially in a zone without much oxygen that is relatively cold, it's going to be very well preserved. And also, if the conditions are quiet, not too much current, it's not even broken. But the same could happen, could be completely destroyed if it was in a place where we have a lot of currents that are going to move up and down the material, and then over time it's going to get more and more eroded, abraded, and broken into small pieces. Yeah, so in the same area where I found this yogurt, we did a project to analyze the transport of microplastics. So we took, this is an estuary there in northwestern Spain, and we took some samples in the river environment before arriving to a small town, and then next to the water treatment plant of the town, in the salt marshes that are then further north, and then already in the marine part of the environment. Well, we found microplastics everywhere. This is not any novel result. Doesn't matter where you take samples on land, in the ocean, or even in the deepest part of the ocean, you're going to find microplastics everywhere. But what was interesting is that, the highest concentration was, as expected, next to the water treatment plant, and the marine part had less. And this was a bit of a surprise for me, because this is where actually these macroplastics tend to accumulate more with the currents and with the tides. But there is a very different behavior of the transport of the small particles and the large particles. So if you go to the beach and you see a lot of bags and big litter, doesn't mean that the accumulation of microplastic is going to be much higher, because they are smaller, so they get also easily transported by the currents, and they tend to accumulate more where the sediments are fine and where you have calmer conditions so that they can settle down. So actually these were very muddy sediments, a bit style like here around Bremerhaven. And we did this correlation also where we analyzed the grain size. So here we have the fine sediments with a lot of microplastics. So we have up to 4,000 particles per kilo, so quite a lot. And then where it gets very sandy, we have less, because when you are at the beach, you have more waves, you have more currents, and then the microplastics get washed away, and they cannot accumulate so easily. And it's a bit similar to the concentration of organic carbon. So we have more organic matter in the finer sediments. So we have also, at the same time, more microplastics and more organic matter. Yeah, so not only physical processes control how plastics are accumulated, but also the fauna and the flora can affect it, and sometimes in a very dramatic way. So I don't know if some of you have been to Helgoland, but in Helgoland is an island here in the North Sea. It's the only rocky island of Germany. There are some colonies of northern gannets, these birds here. And they love these colorful nets of plastic. The blue, they always take the orange ones and the blue ones. And it's a huge problem. It's very sad to see, but there's nothing to do until they stop looking for them, and they prefer the more natural nets, because they put them in the nets and then they get entangled in them. And sometimes you see some dead ones hanging on the net. And the worst is the small ones, the chicks, when they start growing. Maybe at the beginning they were still small, so they put the leg through the net, and then they start growing and they cannot take out their foot anymore because they get stuck. And once it's like that, there is nothing to do. So you see how the chick grows, but you know that it's gonna die soon. So quite dramatic. And that's why it's important, if you see around at the beach some marine litter, now there are more and more places where you can also collect them and throw them away near the beach, so that only all together we can help that the coastline is a bit more clean. But luckily, there are also some other natural processes that help a little bit cleaning up. And this is an example from the Mediterranean Sea, but it happens also a bit similar in this way here, because the seagrass is this kind of plants that we see in the coastal environment, especially this one from the Mediterranean, the Posidonia, that is very big. It creates this kind of structures with all the plant rests that they roll with the waves. And while rolling with the waves, they also, the plastic lines that are around get entangled in them. So there's kind of collecting a bit everything that is in the sediment, again, going up and down. And that makes it at least the pollution is going to be concentrated in the shoreline, in the area also where these plants tend to accumulate later on. Yeah, so a big part comes from land, but not only. There are actually a lot of inputs of plastic directly from the sea. And there was a very famous article recently, because they found a big patch of marine litter in the deepest part of the Mediterranean Sea, here offshore Greece. And as you see, the shape is quite strange. It is a lot concentrated, and they're like a trail. So you can imagine someone in a ship just emptying a bin. The ship keeps moving, so it goes down all the way several thousands of meters, and it gets accumulated in here in the deepest part of the Mediterranean Sea. And this map shows the density of cargo vessels in the Mediterranean Sea. So you see that there are some routes that are very busy, and you can imagine that, of course, probably most of the ships follow the rules of not throwing any litter to the ocean, but even if only a couple do it, there are so many around that it's just gonna keep accumulating in the seafloor. So not only cargo ships are the problem, fishing is also a huge problem. Here you have a map of the places where most fishing activities take place, so a lot around Europe, but also in South America. So in the area around Europe, you saw already this example before, we see a lot of rests of fishing activities, nets that break, but not only nets, also sometimes they throw away the rubbish, and this was observed recently here offshore Argentina, where they are doing right now a cruise. And there are also very interesting colonies of sponges and anemones. And in many of these colonies, there was an extra accumulation of litter around them. And you might think, okay, but probably as the yogurt that we saw at the beginning, probably over time is gonna get a bit smaller. Well, sometimes it might happen, but most of the times it doesn't change much. Here there was a study offshore America, where unfortunately also some German colleagues were working there some decades ago, where also, was a bit less attention paid to pollution. So there were some cheese plastic packages and some cans and other material around. And then over 20 years later, they went back to the area. They found all these rests and sampled them to analyze if there was some kind of degradation after several decades over there. And it was nothing. Because you can imagine here we are at water depths of more than 4,000 meters, so the water is very cold. The biological activity is slow, so even if there are some degradation processes, it's going to take a very, very, very long time. And also because it's far away from the continent, we don't have so much sediment accumulation, so they are not even buried. It's just still at the surface in contact with the water. Probably when you think about plastic pollution in the ocean, you think about these images of the garbage floating in the ocean that we see in the news very often. And yeah, this is sometimes a big problem, and this comes mainly from the rivers, from the continent. So in this map, there is an estimation of how much plastic is coming from the rivers in the different regions. So most of the time is related to the large rivers, most of the pollution, and also because we have very large rivers and a problem of waste management in Asia, Southeast Asia. There is a large production also in this region.
The garbage started at the coast around the ocean and where the people live. And within a few months, the currents moved them into the open ocean. And there they formed the great garbage patches, which are kind of like vacuum cleaners of the ocean. There's 6 of them. There's 5 in each of the subtropical oceans
plastics,
between
the rubbish,
and then there's
some gyres. And these are the famous garbage
patches
that we can find in the seasonal shifts of the winds. But this is actually only less than 1% of the total plastic that reaches the ocean. And the big question is what happens to the garbage started at the coast. It's only a very small proportion that remains floating in the surface. And this is what we can estimate well with our images from satellites, from direct observations, because it's there. That's why here we have some good numbers, more or less. We can tell, but it's a small part. And we cannot know very well yet is how does it go the rest to the deep sea. Yeah, in some places it's particularly concentrated. And an example is here in Calabria, southern Italy, in between Sicily and Calabria. It's a place where it's very steep, the land, and also in the ocean. So we have the mountains that kind of continue underwater. There's also a problem of waste mismanagement over there, because these rivers are not active all the time. In this region, we have very often floods, so it's usually a quite dry environment, but when it rains a lot. So there is a bit the bad habit of leaving rubbish in the canals that are dry, and then there is a natural cleaning process that just brings all the rubbish to the ocean. And like this, it disappears from land, but of course doesn't disappear from nature. It's just underwater, and we don't see it so easily. And in some of these canyons here, they went down with a camera and they found this. So everything you can imagine, from huge blocks of concrete. Well, this is not so dramatic, doesn't matter, it's some rock. But then we have cars, boats, creepy dolls, and everything you can imagine. And all of this, is going to remain there forever. The smaller parts might get also taken by the currents and transported somewhere else. And yeah, this is what we are seeing, that we have these events with floods, but not only floods, we can have what we call turbidity currents. Turbidity currents are some process like sediment avalanches. You can imagine like a snow avalanche going down, but instead of just having a snow, we have sediments in suspension. And all of this makes a cloud of these sediments, moves very fast down the submarine canyons, and it transports together with the sediment a lot of rubbish. And there were some experiments, so it looks like that in the lab, but also in nature it's very similar. So we have this flood of sediments moving down to the deep sea. And yeah, there were some experiments where they put plastics mixed with the sediments in these kind of flows to see where they will end up later in the deposits. So they analyzed the flow, the particles in suspension, and also the deposits down here, and they saw that there is a huge accumulation. Pink are the fibers, and blue are the fragments. So actually, the fibers are getting stuck in the sediments, and we have a high accumulation of fibers in this kind of deposits. And recently, this has been observed also in nature. So there was a study offshore the UK and Ireland in this canyon called the Witter Canyon. So we are in deep water environments going down to several thousands of meters. And they took a sediment core, so they sampled the seafloor, and they analyzed the amount of plastic. So everywhere they found quite a lot. So you see here around 50 grams per 50 particles per 50 grams. So imagine 1 particle per gram at least. And in all of them, there were especially fibers. So we are in an area that is quite far from the continent, actually, but it's still there, even if there is no direct river bringing the plastics. There is a huge accumulation in the canyons. And yeah, compared to other areas, it's quite a high amounts that we can find. And also, again, like in other cases, we see that mainly in the fine-grained materials, in the muddy sediments, is where we find the highest amount of microplastics. So we had a cruise last year to the Bengal Bay offshore Bangladesh, and over there we have this famous Ganges-Brahmaputra delta that brings where most of the sediment coming from the Himalaya is there stored. And as you all know, this is an area also very famous for the production of textile. If you look at your clothes, says made in Bangladesh very often, and a bit of a problem, or quite a big problem, of waste mismanagement. So we thought that the canyon and the bay would be quite dirty, but it was surprisingly, in a positive way, not so dirty. We find, of course, some microplastics. So this one, it was from a core in the deeper part where we found a nylon piece, probably from some fishing activities. And then in the canyon, we also found several microplastics, but not too much. And we think that it's always a balance. So in the previous area where we are far away from the continent, we don't have so much sediment accumulation. So the particles, the pollution we are creating is going to stay in the surface for a long time. In contrast here, because there is so much sediment coming from land, it's going to get buried very fast. So even though the total amount reaching the ocean is probably huge, because also the amount of sediment is huge, it gets diluted in it, which is actually good, because if it is buried fast, it's going to be less in contact with the organisms living in the sea surface and also in the seafloor. Yeah, so we see that turbidity currents that bring material through the submarine canyons can be a very important factor transporting plastics to the deep sea, but also ocean currents that are affecting the seafloor can be another very important factor. Because this is just a model to highlight how this occurs. So in the color you see the depth. The more red it gets, the deeper the particles are. So the particles are moved around laterally by the ocean currents, but they sink also. Actually, most of the plastics don't float, but they sink, especially over time. And then they sink, and while sinking, they are going to be transported by these ocean currents. And this makes that they get also spread all over the oceans. So we are not going to have necessarily in the seafloor the highest concentration in the area where we have these garbage patches, because the garbage patches are generated by surface currents, and at the seafloor we have different surface currents that are moving the particles in a different way. So we don't have a direct connection between the sea surface pollution and the deep sea pollution. And we could see very nicely this connection in a study we did in the Mediterranean Sea. So here is Corsica, Sardinia, and Italy there, and this is the Tyrrhenian Sea. And in this area, we have several ocean currents that move the particles around. And we took different sediment samples in different locations. Some locations where the current is fast. So here in red, you see where the current at the seabed is fast, and in blue, where it's weak. And then we analyze the accumulation of microplastics in these different locations, and what we see is that actually in the places where the currents are the weakest is where we have the highest accumulation of microplastics. All very logical. It's like at the beach that I showed you before. At the beach, we have less microplastics, even though we might have a large amount of macroplastics. And where we have muddy sediments, we tend to have more accumulation of microplastic because it's quiet, so it can settle down and accumulate. So the distribution at the seafloor is strongly controlled by the canyons and also by the currents that are going to redistribute the accumulation at the seafloor. And this is completely different to the accumulation of rubbish that we have at the sea surface. Yeah, so to conclude with that, plastic has become a huge problem and also an important component of our Earth system, because we have plastic that is carbon, so at the end it's getting incorporated in all our natural processes and sedimentation, so this makes that we have to consider this as well. It's increasing more and more, and it's only accumulating. So we don't have, plastic keeps coming, but it's not going anywhere. So it just keeps accumulating over time. And we can find it everywhere and in every single corner of the ocean. The problem of this is that the places where we see that microplastics tend to accumulate in submarine canyons, in places where ocean currents are relatively fast, are also places where some special organisms and like to live, because if we have strong currents, we have also a lot of particles coming, and usually these particles is food for example, here, this is a cold water coral that we can find in the deep sea, for sponges. So we have usually a high biodiversity in these environments. And that's the main problem, that where we find the highest amount of plastic contamination, we also have the highest biodiversity, and this can be also potentially a very big impact. And yeah, that was everything I wanted to tell you today. So thank you very much for coming. And I'm open for discussion in English or in German, as you like. Thanks.
Yeah. I start. Maybe you can still already hear me. Yeah? Okay, perfect. So thanks a lot, Elda, for this very rich talk on a novel entity that is there only for 70, 80 years, but has such a big impact already. As Elda said, she will take questions in English and in German, so please feel free. Blau. Blau. Grün.
Test.
Hello, thank you for such an incredible overview of a presentation. My question is about the ecology that also this plastic remnants are producing. So I wanted to know if, of course, beyond or as well as entering the food cycle and creating effects and death and so on, if they were also influencing and changing ecologies locally. So I'm asking because I worked on freshwater and canals in urban environments, which have lots of waste, quite close to the image you show of Calabria. Mm. And there they were studies that were made, and we also could see, observe that those trash are also influencing life. Like there was a lot of diatoms and biofilms and a lot of grazers. So the ecology had shifted also because of this kind of new habitat. So I was wondering if that is something that you also are observing, like this sort of ecological.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting topic. It's always difficult to evaluate what is the impact, right? Because very often it's done in experiments where you put the organisms in a tank and then you feed them with some plastics and you see if they stop growing or if they have some effects. And in the submarine canyons, it has been observed in many places that this macrolitter sometimes becomes a substrate for other organisms to grow. So for some of them might be even positive because, for example, the sponges need a hard substrate, they need a rock, and very often in the seafloor we have sediments, and they cannot grow in sediments. So for these organisms sometimes might be good. It's also a big discussion with all these cleaning projects that they want to collect the garbage patches. First, it's not a patch like that, it's very separated, and you need a lot of time and energy to go there and clean it around. But also when you collect them, very often there are also organisms growing on them. Yeah, so it's changing the ecology for sure of some of them. For some, it's maybe helping them create a substrate to grow. For others, maybe there will be some toxic problems that they might die, or that they eat them and they can have also some digestion problems. Or so it's a bit, depends on the organism, but for sure it's changing the ecology completely, and we might have different structures that are created because of this pollution.
Yeah, thanks. Is there a problem with like microplastic contamination in scientific laboratories?
Oh, a huge problem, yeah. It's very difficult to do that because first the sampling already, when we go to the sea and you are on the ship, we are in a closed environment and you have the air circulation, so you have a lot of fibers contamination. And that's very difficult, and very often a lot of our sampling material is made of plastic. So first you have to try to get rid of everything that contains plastic, and even sometimes, you can get a bit crazy with all this because everything is a source of plastic. So in the lab, we have labs only for microplastic analysis with some filtering machines so that all the air gets filtered, and try to work always in a clean bench where there are no particles settling down. But you have to rethink everything. So from the sampling material that doesn't contain plastic to the lab, the clothes, so that when you go to the lab and sample, try to avoid synthetic clothing. And that's a critical point because especially when we work at sea, it's a bit cold, so most people wear these fleece pulleys, no? So you know, these ones that are very comfy, warm, and so, but produce a lot of microplastics. And we see also that more and more in our samples, we just get microplastics. Even if you don't look for them, you take some samples, look under the microscope, and it's full of fibers. So always is, the fragments is no question, fragments is probably always just real material, but from the fibers, unless you control the sampling and analysis procedure, it's very easy to get contamination.
Questions?
I think I have two big questions, so sorry. I mean, I imagine that it's hard to respond, especially with your knowledge and experience. Thank you for sharing with this, and the visuals were super informative. So one is, have you ever tried, or someone from your team, to generate a list of products that we can buy that do not, produce or do not affect so much ecologies and environment that we live in? It's not only we and the outside, it's in fact everything now is mixed, yes? So this is one question. The second is, have you or someone from your team tried to speak with some companies, corporates, who in fact they are responsible for using plastic material because it's cheaper and generate more income?
Yeah, well, this is a huge issue for the whole society, that only from political movements can be moved. And of course, politics is moved by the society in part, but there is a big lobby of the companies and the production of plastics. And there have been many discussions to try to create an international agreement to reduce the amount, especially of only one-use plastics. But there hasn't been any agreement in all the tries that have been done in the last years. Because of this lobby work that is a huge, huge movement behind, a lot of money that is there. And as an individual, of course, we can try to reduce the amount of plastic we use. There are some laws now that they make them write down if it is plastic containing in there, but it is really complicated, because very often it's not only about these microspheres that we see in the beauty products, for example. There is a lot of plastic also in shampoo, in gel, in everything. And this sometimes it's only written with the formula name or the E wherever, and most of us don't know it's plastics. Pretty much everything contains plastic. It's almost impossible to avoid. It's just now a matter also from try to push the companies to reduce this use in their products. But from the user, yeah, I guess the most obvious thing, of course, the packaging. And here in Germany, I think is not too bad compared to other places, at least with the fund system, that you return your bottle, and this reduces already quite a lot the amount of cans, bottles that are laying around in rivers and in beaches. And that's something quite easy to do, in my opinion, that everyone is happy about. And there are many places. Well, it's actually very rare to have such a system, even within Europe. So there are some of these activities that could be done to at least move a bit step forward. But then we can, of course, have to implement solutions to try to stop the arrival of microplastics to the rivers through the water treatment plants. Also to stop in rivers, because once it reaches the ocean, we cannot stop it to spread. And keep controlling more that there is less production of rubbish from ships, from local activities at the coast. Very often is know where it comes from, and then it's the local governments that have to take action also.
There was one other question up there. Yeah, just hand it over.
Yeah, well, maybe first to the policy thing. Yeah, unfortunately, I published an article a few years ago arguing why an international treaty on plastics will be almost impossible to negotiate. And just last week we had or 2 weeks ago, we had the failure. But as a sedimentologist, what I was really interested, so I was going to ask the substrate question. So the good question was already taken, but I was really interested in one of your first slides where you said there are some signs that plastics have started morphing with sediments or with substrate and starting to create real sediments. Now it's too early, geologically speaking, for us to have real sediments, but do you see any of that beyond like plastic melting from the sun into rock and then becoming part of it?
Yeah, another part or place where they find it is in corals. Corals, they feed in all the particles that are in the water, and then if there are plastics around, they keep it in their structure. And it's just carbonate, so once the coral dies, it's going to stay in this rock that is carbonate rock. So the amount is nowadays likely still not so huge in most of the environments. That is not that you take a spoon and you see it's plastic. It's mixed within it, but still we think that is a relatively high amount, and that's why nowadays we have a new project where we want to estimate how much of this anthropogenic carbon we have in the whole organic carbon in the marine sediments from the coast to the deep sea, because it can create in a proportion at the end, can even affect the carbon cycle, because it's just also, made out of carbon. And when we measure as sedimentologists or geologists, a very common measurement in sediments is how much organic carbon is there. But if we think that it is all natural organic carbon, but maybe 10% is because of plastic, it can be biased as well, the result. And that's something we have having a bit concern recently also when we take samples of the water, for example, with these typical Niskin bottles, that there is one, I think, behind here, no? Well, somewhere here, there are some of these bottles with which you can take waters from the ocean. And because it's plastic, very often with the electrostatic energy, the fibers get stuck there. So when you filter the water, you have some very often microfibers in there. So if we measure how much organic carbon there was in the water, but then we get also some contamination from microfibers. So it's a big of a problem.
Okay,
yes.
There would be time for one last question. If there's none, yeah, please.
On one of the diagrams you showed, it said like atmospheric plastic and a question mark. So is there plastic floating around in the atmosphere in significant amounts too?
Well, the very small particles can be blown by the wind. And so question mark, because I guess it's a bit difficult also to measure, especially in the offshore part. Because when we are in the vessel, you can put some nets to collect it, but it's a bit hard to distinguish also if it comes from the ship itself. But the wind is able to transport, let's say, like very fine sand and smaller. So plastics is also within this range, so it could be blown as well, partially.
Maybe I put myself on the list as a very last question, just to turn it into a kind of positive outlook. At least it's a try. So we have this very stable material, which is kind of everywhere and is impacting the environment in quite a negative way. So what can we do except reducing consumption and production? Is there ways to get it out of the environment again?
Yeah, unfortunately, I guess there is not a very positive answer to that. Well, where we can do is everywhere where we are, at least the coastal environment, the rivers, even on land, just if you see some litter, just take it. And so that also our children see that it's important to clean it so that it doesn't reach at the end the ocean. Yeah, the smaller particles is impossible, but still, yeah, it's getting the bigger ones out so that they cannot become smaller ones in the future. And I didn't mention one thing because we are talking a lot about the plastic itself, but one of the huge problems that we don't know yet what is going to happen is the plastics have a lot of chemicals in them that give them their properties of being hard or flexible or whatever is needed for the type of material. And usually they are in the structure of the polymer, but when the polymer starts to get degraded, is at some point it's gonna come out of the material itself and can be as part of diluted molecules in the water. And this is, many of them might have also, very toxic behaviors for many organisms, and this is still something that we don't know what might be the consequences.
So thanks a lot for being here.